Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Kyle Dupick.
So, as the resident pitching guy, there's always a conversation regarding velocity, command, trade offs. How do we train one? How do we train the other? You sent an interesting post on X to me the other day, DM'd. You want to walk through the walk rate? Why was that interesting to you? Why did you send it to me?
I think the thing that stood out to me the most, because our season just ended, and just looking at like the struggle throughout the year, and where just our team ended up, like our the number of walks that we gave up was significantly higher. Yeah, we still had success this year, which was great. But I could see that this is a place where we could grow. And then also it's something that's been thrown at people, of like, oh, you only develop, velo or stuff or whatever, but like they can't throw strikes. So yeah, okay, you have great velocity, you have great stuff, but you can't locate it. And then, you're not making it up, like you're not playing as much, or guys aren't moving up levels because they don't command the ball well enough. And so it becomes a question of, okay, now a guy might not have, great velocity, great stuff, but he has great command. So do organizations feel like they can take a guy with great command and develop velocity and stuff? Is that where we're at now? I don't know, but it still feels like the thing that is getting most people noticed is velo and stuff. And then the command piece seems like it's getting a little bit forgotten, but now it's starting to come back. And at least from what I'm seeing on social media, different people are starting to talk more about command, driveline being one of them. Like, how do you develop command? And so what was interesting about this tweet from Tango Tiger, I'm sure every analytics person on Twitter knows who this is. But anyways, he put out this really interesting tweet about the walk rate at the MLB. I'm assuming this is the MLB level. That year to year, there's no correlation between the walk rate, or the correlation is really low. So basically, what that means is that one year's walk rate does not predict the following year's walk rate. So there's not really any correlation between, for example, the year that we had this year. Maybe we can chalk it up to just it being a bad year. Like, it's not a predictor for how many guys we're going to walk next year, which I think that's kind of an encouraging thing of, like, if you have if these stats are correct, then, if you have a bad year where you walk a ton of guys, this might not be necessarily indicative of you having a high walk rate next year. Now, we have to qualify this. This is on MLB data. This might not be for other levels, because, at the major league level, you have an abundance of talent. Like, if guys are struggling with command, there's somebody else very easily at hand that you can find to replace. So that might be the reason, an explanation for that. But the other thing that I thought was really, really interesting too with this was that in-season walk rate is more highly correlated to the next, like, your walk rate in the first month, as it's showing here, is highly correlated to the next month, then to the next month, to the next month. And so the direction I'm interpreting here, extrapolating here, the direction that your walk rate is going is more predictive of where it's going to go next, potentially. And as we look at this graph, I think it'll be kind of interesting to see what we see there. And then where I kind of want to go with this is, okay, from an ecological perspective or framework, can we understand, like, how would we understand why this is occurring? And then is there anything that we can do about it? So that's kind of where I was thinking of starting our conversation today.
Let's begin.
right? May to June, etc. So a couple month period each. And
With the
that's the one
exception of the
where
last one, July to October. So July, August, October. Well, I guess that makes sense because October is just
October's
like 1
less.
week. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is, yeah.
And less teams near the end of September baseball, etc. as well. That's the other one. So walk through that one. What's different that's being communicated there? That is the year to year, or is that something different?
I'm trying to understand it right now. Walk rate in May,
season
June.
correlation. So this is still in season.
Yeah,
right?
but what I'm struggling with is the percentages here. Walk rate in April, May, or March, April, sorry. And this is walk rate in May, June, and July and October. So I'm kind of confused.
It looks to me like it's just a different graphical representation, right? Your X and Y axis.
Yeah,
is telling
with the
you-
line being the correlation is 1-to-1, and so it's how far off is.
Yes.
But I guess that's why I'm a little.
And they said it was
confused at what I'm looking
0.8 in the previous, so that would be close to that 1-to-1, but not exactly.
Oh, okay, if maybe I'm understanding this correctly. This here, the bottom is correlated. So, like, what's the correlation between these two? Like, what's the correlation between March and April versus May, June, July, October?
Okay.
I think that's what's being looked at. So, like, for example,
essentially early to late.
Yeah, like, so July, October has a lower correlation to March, April, maybe. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not 100% sure because, like, what are these percentages? So if my walk percentage in July, October is 7%, and the walk rate in March, April is north of 8, it's got a low correlation. I don't know. That's where I don't understand what I'm looking at here.
Yeah.
We need Robert Fry or somebody on this one.
Yeah, that's right.
maybe we'll cut that part out. But anyways.
Well, it's I think the two things that jump out right away are, because you're asking the question why. Why is it not correlated year to year? But it is correlated within the season. And you're seeing him saying that it's essentially 0 and then 0.8. I mean, that's from a statistical standpoint, that's huge. So obviously part of it is unequivocally that guys are pitching more, right? And they're in game-like environments. They're pitching in games more. And so they're getting better at the very thing that they're doing. And yet the other thing, though, that you said earlier that can't be ignored, and there's probably other reasons, is if you're not very good at the beginning of the year, they're just going to find somebody else. And by the time kind of the year goes on, we know that injuries happen less. And so you're probably going to find your core guys that you're going to more and more. Whereas in early of the year, you're probably going to, you're potentially going to see teams explore a little bit more, figure out who's, especially because bullpens can be volatile, what starters kind of, particularly in the back end of your rotation, essentially who's your core roster that you're kind of running with for most of the year, give or take a handful of guys that you're sending up and down or get injured in the middle of the year. So those are at least two of the ideas that make sense to me, both just the practical, playing the game aspect, but also the figuring out who your staff is and running with the best guys that have shown that year, particularly if there's not a correlation year to year, right? Like if it's not like, well, last year it was really good. Well, we don't know what that'll look like this year. And we kind of know that in the bigs. Bullpens can be volatile. So they kind of figure out who's having a good year and they just run with them.
And the other thing too that we have to remember when we're looking at this is it's an aggregate, right?
Correct.
So a lot of teams are going to look at, a guy's history with walks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's their walk percentage? And some of this comes back to what I like about this is it's not too macro. Okay, so like he's got it broken down into 3 different sections of the season, and the first third versus the second third and the last third. And what this is illustrating to me, and this makes sense even too, like, and some of this is just logic, but like it also fits with an ecological approach, is that, right, you're dynamic, you don't change, you're not static. How you start is not how you finish. And people have known this for a really long time. And it's a question of like, okay, at what point, how many data points do I need before my data begins to stabilize, right? And so like early in the year, might not be enough, because there's all these different factors, right? Getting reacclimated to playing games. The weather is also different at the beginning of the year versus the middle of the year and the end of the year. And so you have all these different factors that probably play into the fact of like why guys' walk rates are so much higher at the beginning of the year versus the middle of the year. But what I think is interesting is that, let's see, I wanted to look at, okay, where it was interesting. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So in 2019, the walk rate actually was higher at the end of the year than the middle of the year. The middle of the year was a little bit better at times than, then you would assume that the best part of the year is the end, but it doesn't appear like that. It appears like the middle of the year is where you have your peak. More often than not, you have your peak, like lowest walk rate. That doesn't seem to be always true, but it seems like sometimes
the blue line is pretty consistent.
Yes,
the earliest,
it's always,
it seems always the worst. Yeah. In fact, it's really hard to find looking at the chart a year other than what, 2021,
where it was the same.
It was about the same. Yeah.
Between, I mean, but that also makes sense because you got 2020, right? So like that's a reacclimation year. You're reacclimating to playing, like everything got thrown off there, I would say, you know? And so I don't know. I think that's really, really fascinating that it kind of goes either way. And the reason is that I think at the end of the year, guys are starting to get fatigued, right? Fatigue, I think is one role for why guys lose their ability to command the baseball, right? As your central nervous system becomes more fatigued, it no longer can, one, you're going to have less resources to work with. Two, the resources or your system is going to respond not as quickly. So therefore you can, I guess from an ecological perspective, your dexterity and from a standpoint of like degeneracy, meaning the number of possible configurations you have goes down, right? So you have a loss of degrees of freedom, you have a loss of degeneracy, meaning you have fewer movement solutions that can work. Therefore, it would make sense that, your, what was the other word that I used? Not dexterity. Whatever. But anyways, so like all that would go down, leading to like less command, your ability to put the ball exactly where you want as frequently as you want to. And so I think, yes, pitching, I'm jumping too far ahead, but basically, I guess actually let's start with this. Okay. So that's one problem, right? Is fatigue. And so
I don't know if you'd agree with this. Just, heard it in passing when I was working through, when I adopted the arm care platform several years ago, working through their resources. Their claim was that, a lot of people fatigue is set in when you see the radar gun go down. And they said, our experience and our data says that the first thing that goes down is not the radar gun, but the person's ability to command. I thought that was interesting. That was different than what I had heard in the past.
No, I mean, it's 100% right because, right, velocity is the result of you being able to, again, velocity, going back to the more ways that you have, the more to because there's not just one way to produce velocity, right? You can be quick, or you can apply force over a longer period of time, or you can apply that force very quickly in a short window. So you have all these different ways to mask. You can muscle up and throw it harder, or you can be more relaxed, right? So like there's all these different ways that you can throw the ball harder. So you could probably mask a velocity like drop for a while, like your fatigue, like your system is fatigued, but you can mask the fact of like, I'm just going to muscle up here and give it, recruit more of my body to be able to throw this harder, right? And put more energy into it. Whereas when the nervous system is fresher, it doesn't need to do all that, right? It can very efficiently, with less effort, throw the ball harder, right? And so central nervous system fatigue and the rate, like you could say power, right? The loss of power, the rate at which how fast you can contract your muscles, probably is going to decrease first, right? So even right from an S&C principle standpoint, speed in terms of just pure sprint velocity probably will drop first. Maybe not sprint velocity. I actually think maybe more like a tap test or something like that might be more sensitive to that. But your rate of force development is probably going to drop first, and that's more related to your central nervous system fatiguing. And so that would then make sense that command may be more sensitive to that. But that's more because I think guys aren't trained. Like it's a lot harder to will a pitch to be a strike than it is to just grunt harder and throw it harder,
Yeah.
And which is true in general of developing velocity versus command. But I still think even if a person is trained to locate, that's where I think you can use these two as corollaries, because sometimes I think those two things would maybe actually map a little bit more. But I think there's, I don't know if there's another way to assess, in game that a person is fatigued necessarily. Sometimes it's just watching them, does it look like that was more effort? I don't know. That's where, pro teams, right? They have Hawkeye and these other things, and they can start to measure some of these things a little bit.
I heard a podcast that shall remain. Thank you. Nameless and I get what they were saying here, right? But there's we got somebody in our biomechanics lab, and we found that they threw 98 plus all the time when their stride length was 105%, of their body height. But then what we saw was during the game, using all these systems, the feedback they were getting is that it would go down to the 94s and the 92s and whatnot, and their velocity would drop. And the conclusion from that was, so therefore, we just need to get the guy to always go 105%. Disregarding, disregarding that,
that there was a reason for why it probably changed.
Why was he changing? The fatigue, et cetera, how he was interacting with the game, how he was interacting with his own body, how, and I think that that's something that we just don't. So even with the tech that we have, my sense is that a lot of people, what they'll do is your mechanics are changing. I go, exactly. They have to. That's the point. I know Rob Gray has talked about, and I've struggled a little bit with this in pitching, been thinking about this lately. What are the invariants in pitching? Rob has thrown out, the kinetic chain and, a consistent release point. And the kinetic chain one makes sense to me, but I do remember years ago, it's actually, I don't know if he still works.
I feel that makes a little less sense. Depends what you mean by kinetic chain. I think you have to define it.
Yeah, basically that you're working from the ground up, and that those things are going to stack to transfer force. Sure. That was one of his invariants, which, as a person who doesn't know enough about that, that makes enough intuitive sense. I just remember, and this is more of a sidebar to get to the second one, but I just do remember years ago sitting in a conference with a guy. I don't know if he's still in the Braves minor league organization, but he cited a paper that was written in, I think it was Japan, and I could never find it in English, but he said that there was something in the arm that, whether it was the shoulder or elbow, I couldn't remember exactly what it was, but that it went out of order in the kinetic chain. And I thought that was fascinating. Setting that aside, the release point one is one that I've struggled a little bit with, because the release point, you've heard people for years talk about having a consistent release point. And yeah, I get it. Like, that helps you know where the ball's going more consistently. And yet, even just from an ecological standpoint, I've gone, yeah, but if you could throw multiple pitches out of multiple slots, like, that would be harder on the hitter. So is that something that is that actually an invariant, or is that something that we could train better to get guys to throw from different slots? Or does it actually have to be the same release point? And of course you have not just release point in terms of where your arm slot is, but release point in terms of vertical and horizontal. Like, it's a 3-dimensional space we're talking about, not just. So I will admit, I don't know necessarily what to think about that either. Just thinking through, like, I think it would be useful as a pitcher to throw multiple pitches out of multiple slots. But is that practical? Can you do that? Could we still train command and have guys be good enough to do that? The ecological side of me says, well, yeah, if we create a more adaptable, robust athlete who has abundance of motor solutions, then if that's how we're training them, then I think they would be good at that. In fact, I think they might be better at having a more quote unquote consistent arm slot if we allowed them to explore a little bit, instead of just saying, no, we have to have this one consistent. But there are several studies that, look at these professional players and say they all move differently to get to a more consistent, like, it's the thing that varies the least is the release point. And I can acknowledge that. And yet, from my ecological side of me, I'm going, but I wonder if we could push that, I wonder if we could train that differently.
And that's where I think, if I'm being literal, yes, the release point is the most consistent, but it also still has variation in it. So for example, you could probably, if you can manipulate your fingers and your hand and your wrist, your pronation and the timing of that a little bit, that also will manipulate where that ball ends up. Even if your hand, right, is literally in the same spot that it was before, but if your wrist orientation is slightly different, or how your fingers are and the pressure is slightly different, it's going to have some effect on where that pitch is going to end up. And so that's where, I think it is starting to get more out there of people understanding that, like, we don't repeat our mechanics. Like, I'm hearing more and more coaches understand that. And so I think that's really good. But then it becomes back to of like, okay, how do we get consistency of performance? And so I want to kind of transition to talking about, okay, what's the ecological view of like command? And the way that I think about it is, like, we first have to understand the problem. What is the problem that the pitcher is trying to solve in order to have what we call command? And I think we also have to define that because, right, Driveline has talked about, right, the average miss is what, 12 to 17 inches? It's probably not 17. It's probably 12 to 15 or something like that. Because I remember I looked into it because the plate's like 17 inches, and I forget what the diagonal is, but so you have like a decent miss pattern and so, okay, we can't necessarily, we tend to miss on average about that amount. But what I think is missed in this whole conversation is the fact that people can actually throw the ball exactly where they intend to throw the ball. Like, I think we forget that. Like, yeah, of course, oftentimes we do miss, but you can still actually throw the ball exactly where you're intending to throw it. Like, the whole thing of even, watching Ichiro, knock over bats and different stuff like that, right? Like, okay, oh, well, he missed 10 inches. Well, then he ain't hitting the bat that he's trying to throw at, like, so it's like, I just don't buy this whole thing that like, oh, it's so hard and it's just random luck that you actually throw the ball to your intended target. Like, that to me is complete bollocks. Like, I just think like there's just too much evidence of people actually hitting their spot, so with like, okay, yeah, maybe you missed it by like one like millimeter, is moved just that's, to me, that's close enough, right? That 10-inch miss is like, that's pretty significant, right? So that's where I want to
contextual, isn't it? Right? Like, There's
Right.
so
So
much
like
with
I guess here's where I'm going with this too, with from an ecological perspective. All right, let's start with the ideal. Okay. And then we can work to like why the misses. Right. So to me, in order for if I'm thinking about this ecologically, okay, it is the intention of the athlete, attending to the right information, connected to that information. Their movement is coupled to that. And the whole thing self-organizes around that connection to that information. So, for example, because we've talked about this before of like perspective control. So for me, this is where perspective control comes into play for a pitcher, is that as their body is moving in space down the mound to deliver the ball to their target, their body is picking up and perceiving information about how are they doing to be able to do that, right? And so you're having the feedback from the optical flow. You're having optical flow. You're having your kinesthetic awareness of where your body is in space, and then when your foot hits the ground, right? So like that information, plus you could say where your eyes and head are relative to the target when you throw, and then your sense of feeling of where your hand is, and the ball and all that sort of stuff. And so, and then how all that works towards the target. And then once the ball is out of your hand, then it's pretty much said and done at that point. But what perspective control I think helps me, or like how I think it plays in here, is the body is self-organizing the closer. So like, I really like this, that, I want to say heuristic, but like, what's the word? Mantra, I guess you could say, that South Carolina, or Coastal Carolina had one of the years that they went to the College World Series: will over skill. Right? So it wasn't about repeating your mechanics. It was that you willed it. And so your body, right, as we're moving to it towards our target, is going to make adjustments based upon how strong the intention is towards that. The body's going to try to correct any of those mistakes that are going on. Maybe you started a little bit too fast down the mound. Maybe you didn't get in your hip as much as you did before, or maybe you start, whatever it is, when your foot hit the ground, it inverted. Yes, it inverted a little bit more because of how you hit the ground. You start to roll the ankle this way a little bit, or maybe it everted, whatever it is, right? And threw something off up the chain, but you still are able to make an adjustment. Maybe your arm slot, your arm swing was a little bit longer, or whatever it is, but your body makes an adjustment for that to get the ball and that pitch to that spot, right? And so to me, that's where perspective control kind of comes into play, is that the system is actually able to, in real time, as it's perceiving the information, make slight adjustments to achieve the outcome that it wants. And yes, there are certain principles that make certain things more likely. Like, this has just been even my own experience of like learning how to control my center of mass down the mound, and like finding a certain rhythm that like just made it feel like it was so much easier to put the ball where I want. But that comes back to, again, from an ecological perspective, I'm having to learn how my body relates to the task and the task environment, right? And so for me, that's where an ecological approach changes how we're thinking about this. It's no longer about just mechanics, repeating my mechanics or hitting certain mechanical checkpoints, or, my pelvis or whatever, or my foot, like that dictates everything else that's going to happen. And if you screw that up, then it's going to screw up the outcome. And that's why your outcomes are not very good. And it's like, yeah, maybe a little bit, but I do believe, like, from an ecological approach, I think that intention and the fact that the body self-organizes and optimizes around how strong of an intention, whatever intention is the strongest, it's going to organize itself around that. So for example, what I mean by intention there is that, okay, obviously every pitcher is intending to throw to the target, but if they have fear, right, all of a sudden they get a little nervous, or like they feel like, what, I feel like I need more space here. Well, then that becomes more of the priority. That priority is higher than the priority or the intention to throw to the target. And so then that might be why an athlete, doesn't actually execute what they're trying to execute, because the system is actually trying to self-organize around a different priority.
Whenever I've heard coaches I respect talk about command, and you sort of peel back the layers of what they really think will do it, they wouldn't use this language,
Right.
but they always say something that relates to attention and intention. And as you're talking, the thing that comes to mind for me is, and you'll know this well as a hitting coach, when I've had to throw batting practice, there will be times when I miss, and I'll miss 2 or 3 times in a row, and I'll realize that I wasn't really focused. I was just throwing batting practice to the guys. And if I become incredibly focused on the task at times, which is I need to hit this spot because I want to move the ball around so he learns to hit different locations as he's preparing for this game. But I also might, and this is what you alluded to, and this is what I'm sort of thinking in real time. At times I need to be, and I've seen this, be completely connected to the task, which is getting the hitter out, connecting to their behavior, throwing a pitch that starts at the front hip and then sinks back into the zone, where I'll use the behavior of the batter. And yet at other times, I really, really, really need to just connect to the target. I need to simplify and sort of have this tunnel vision towards that. But other times, as you acknowledged, I remember at times pitching where I could feel when the ball would come off my hands. I knew right away if it was or off my fingers, if it was a good pitch or not. And so I would start to become aware of, I'm sort of starting to talk about almost like Newell's triangle, like how constraints shape behavior, right? And so some of those are task oriented that I'm more intending and paying attention to. Sometimes it's now when I pitch and I haven't pitched in a long time and I can start to feel my front hip, and I have to be a little bit more aware of how I adjust in order to land differently, because I can't keep landing. I'm not in shape. I don't throw all the time. Sometimes, having to be, and maybe this one isn't as clean, but man, like when you're in a different environment, I'm reminded of, Billy Chappell. What's the movie with Kevin Costner? For Love of the Game, right? He has the phrase that he says, "Clear the mechanism," and the environment essentially is not bothering him anymore. He's not worried about the crowd, right? He's not worried about pitching in Yankee Stadium there. He's just connected to the batter, the umpire, and his catcher. And so, for me, what that elucidates is that making an athlete who doesn't figure out what exactly they need to pay attention to all the time and intend all the time, and they found the answer, but instead helping them be adaptable, to be very connected, as you talked about, prospective control, that there's all this information that they can interact with, and it might be different based on how they're feeling, where they're pitching, what kind of hitter's up, etc. That's what it's making me think of, is making a highly attuned, adaptable athlete that they can pay attention to any number of factors in order to adjust pitch to pitch if they're making a mistake, or repeat a pitch, find what's working that day, or what maybe worked a previous day. That's what it's making me think. It's not, here's the answer, but instead, we need to train the athletes in different ways every day to go, how can you command the ball better today based on who you are today, and how will that change tomorrow and the next day?
I think there's an interesting dynamic there between variability, and I can't remember if we talked about this in another podcast. While I'm on that point of another podcast, for those people who are wondering about, this random word that I threw out there of perspective control, that's been mentioned a couple of times. There's an episode that we recorded with Andrew Wilson, specifically where we go over and cover that. So I'd recommend people who are wondering about that to circle back and look for that episode, because I don't want to spend a ton of time trying to elucidate or expound upon that. But when it comes to variability, right, I think this is the thing that a lot of times, what I see in like pitching development, right, is like, okay, let's do different things all the time. And I think the old school coaches kind of push against that. They're worried about that. And I think in some ways, rightly so, but what we are saying is like, or rather how I nuance it and how I think about it is, okay, there's a time to be focused on consistency of outcome, and the variability is going to go down there, but like it's going to go down in terms of how I'm thinking about my practice design. It's not going to go down in actuality. Why? Because the athlete is dynamic and the environment is dynamic, generally speaking, and you're going to have these subtle changes. And sometimes we want to be intentional about, switching some things up and adding some variability in there, but like more specifically along the lines of scenarios that the athlete would find themselves in the game, right? So there are different modes, right? Like if I'm going to, in my mind, at the beginning of practice, I'm going to have more variability. That's going to be less representative. That's going to be more out there, more exploration. That's going to be more on the edges of what an athlete's natural performance abilities are. Let's take, for example, Marcus Stroman, right? Most people have seen his warm-up routine and how he'll throw in different ways as he's playing catch. But then as you get closer and closer to the game, the amount of variability and the amount of exploration he's doing becomes less and less. I think this hurt. I don't remember because I'd never watched Nestor Cortez pitch a ton. But I get the sense that he doesn't goof around as much as he used to in terms of his delivery and in game. Whereas I don't know how much Stroman is still doing that too, but I think that's where those things were opening up degrees of freedom such that when he comes back towards the middle and there's still some variability there, but it's not as extreme variability, right? And so and it comes back more to that variability is being used to execute something. So it's focused on the outcome, not just exploring to understand, right? That I think there's two like often when I'm exploring to understand versus I am exploring to execute. And then there's the third one of like, now I'm just simply focused on executing. And that previous experience lends itself to an affordance, basically, to utilize something that I picked up in my exploration. Or exploration can be simply helping us attune, become attuned and calibrated to our environment. So there's multiple levels to that. And so I wanted to say that all that to say is that I think we also need to understand that you can be ecologically driven and also have what seems like less variability, but rather the focus shifts. When your focus shifts to performance and the execution side of things, the variability is naturally going to go down. And that's how if I'm going to talk to a traditional coach, or a traditional coach is going to be like, I don't like that. What you're doing, you're just too variable, like whatever, and like is kind of poo-pooing it. I can still maintain some variability. It's just going to look a little bit different, but it's going to be more execution focused. And it's going to kind of naturally pull the variability down when I focus more on execution. So that's what I wanted to at least throw in there as well. But I think there's a natural progression, and that's something that I hope we've kind of elucidated throughout this podcast, on like the episode of like serious play and how do we integrate things back. The one episode on Variability, like it was kind of trying to thread this of like, there's a process by which we utilize exploration to help us in execution.
Mm-hmm. And this is there's the post framework, the periodization of skill work, and there's multiple out there that follow that exact line of thinking, that there is both a daily exploration to performance as well as a more long-term, when are the periods of higher exploration versus more performance oriented, and everywhere in between. But it does seem foolish to, again, from an ecological standpoint, to sit in one, right? That's like for a college baseball, to say, well, The fall is like kind of about performance, but also getting better because it's the fall. I'm trying to compete for a spot, but get better. Once I get to my winter time, I'm all exploration, and then I get to the spring and I'm all performance. That's not going to work.
Or at least that's not optimized, I would say.
Yes.
Like, I think you're leaving something on the table.
You are.
Right. It's just like lifting, right? Like, oh, okay, I'm not going to lift very much, or hardly at all, or not at all in the fall. I'm going to lift really hard in the winter, and then I'm not going to lift at all in the spring. Like, that's like, and I see that on the offensive side, like, oh, okay, I'll use weighted bats, in the off season, but I won't touch them at all in season. It's like, well, then, people don't realize, and this to loop this back to pitching, like weighted anything is weight training. It follows all the same principles. So just like in weight training,
including a regular ounce bat and a 5-ounce ball, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it all has weight to it.
Too.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that doesn't have weight is air, right? Like there's no material that that we're going to use that has no weight to it, or basically nothing. So like, this whole thing of like, oh, like weighted anything is bad makes no sense to me. But anyways, it's just how much, right? And for the individual. But anyways, so the principles of lifting, you have training residuals. Is well known in the S&C world, right? And so when it comes to these sort of things, and the training residuals also apply to skill, right? And there's probably not as much research on the training residuals when it comes to skill work, and like, because really, when you look at the work of Davids and Arahu, forgive me if I got Arahu's name wrong, but there, and I think was it Michael's as well. I can't remember, but anyways, their paper on like what is exactly acquired in skill acquisition or skill ac. They basically talk about like, okay, ecological dynamics actually we don't view things as skill acquisition. Rather, we view it as skill adaptation. And that language maps very well onto S&C principles, because we view what we're doing in the weight room as creating adaptations. The body is adapting to the stress that we're putting it under. And so the same principles are going to apply here to skill, that the system is going to adapt. And now, again, ecological dynamics, right? The body and the human system is dynamic, and it's going to change over time. So like, we have to understand that with all these sort of things, in what we're talking about, like to your point of exploration, right? That we don't just explore at one time of the season. That needs to be worked in throughout, because it helps the sensitivity and the adaptation and the to be able to like at least maintain, right? Like, so again, like when you go away from something, okay, there's a residual, and how long does that residual hang around before it starts to decay and disappear? Right. And so like the more we explore and add some little levels of exploration in there, it's going to maintain the potentially either the attunement or the sensitivity. It's going to, you potentially are going to be able to hold on to things longer. And also, there are other benefits of like making new discoveries. You can maintain growth, all that sort of stuff.
Well, even sticking with your S&C example, this will be a little bit of a poor one, but trying to connect to it. Like if you're on a 3-day-a-week program, right, and those are your really heavy lifting days where you're trying to create those adaptations. In a sense, those are your performance days, and of course we wouldn't call them that because you're always in the weight room training for something. But if we're just taking that, because I think the S&C world is so good because we intuitively understand that you have to push yourself and create adaptations, not do the same thing over and over, right? We intuitively know that, but then we don't apply it to other places. Well, how foolish would it be in a sport like baseball where you're playing 3-4 times a week, and then you're in between practices, can be a little bit harder, especially if you're not a starting pitcher where you're on a regular regimen and you're just pitching every Friday or every Saturday or whatever, and you have that space in between, but you're a reliever or you're a position player or whatever. How foolish would it be if we were in the S&C world and we treated our performance days in the weight room like, well, I can't do too much here. I'll try to get better in the weight room in between those days. Well, of course, that intuitively doesn't make sense. And so I think that's another reason why exploration is so important, is because you have to like even on our game days, right? That might be your quote unquote high day because you had to be ready to perform that day. And so then you need to figure out what that looks like. How do I continue to get better during the year if I didn't pitch that day? Do I throw after the game or do I throw the next day? The point is how can I continue to make those adaptations instead of just knowing if I went into the weight room every day and just kind of tried to hold serve, I would eventually just keep getting, I would get worse. The same thing can happen during a season where if you're not trying to continue to explore and make adaptations to become more adaptable, to me, there isn't really a holding serve in that. You're either continuing to become more adaptable or you're becoming less adaptable and you're finding yourself kind of in these ruts that are a little harder, or you're just getting worse, you know?
And to go to kind of make a connection with another episode that we did before on the Vervaeke episode on integrating things back in, one of the things that we talked about was, you know, when it comes to machine learning models, right? Like, oftentimes if you feed it too many variables, it'll overfit to certain things. And so like the way to overcome that is to add noise into the system. You know, again, like the overfitting is basically losing the forest through the trees. Like you just get hyper focused on one tree and like you miss the whole forest. And so like what exploration does, it provides a little bit of noise. It provides a little bit of something different, something unique. But that also, the thing is that you have to be intentional about introducing a little bit of noise. Because all of us, if we're doing exploration, whatever, because this is the thing that I've seen with athletic throws. Athletic throws are basically just jump throws. That's all they are. And you're like, there's not actually a lot of variability if all you're ever doing is just jumping.
Yeah.
It's literally the same thing the whole time. So is it really that athletic, or are we just calling a jump throw an athletic throw when really it's just one? There's not a whole lot of exploration that's going on there. And so that's where we all fall into ruts, essentially. Like our exploration can actually become rote. And so that's where at some level you do have to be a little bit intentional, but that's okay that, you know, for certain periods of time, like it's kind of familiar and comfortable, your exploration. Like in the episode that we did on transfer of training, we talked about repetition is the ground or the soil in which spontaneity is birthed. And so understanding that too, like these attractor states that we naturally find ourselves drifting towards, when we do exploration, can sometimes spawn or cause unique things to emerge, things that we've never done before. So we have to understand, like, it's a both and sometimes you have to be intentional about it, but other times it's simply just going in there, doing your exploration and kind of flowing. And then eventually an affordance will naturally emerge from that. And so I think that's okay. Like, I think, because this is the thing that I struggle with. And the reason why I'm bringing this up and I'm kind of harping on it is because so many of the people within the EcoD space talk about exploration as if I have to be super creative and come up with something novel every single time. And if I don't come up with something novel, it's a failure to adhere to the principles and I'm doing something wrong. And when I come back to like, what was ecological dynamics for me, it was freeing. And so for me, that causes a level of stress, thinking that I have to be unique and come up with something super novel adds a level of stress to this. And then that's why I think people gravitate back towards a traditional approach and will push away from an ecological approach. Whereas I don't think you need to go back to the traditional approach, but rather understand how these things work together to actually allow for emergence, right? Yeah. That like these ecological concepts and how all this stuff plays together.
Well, I think that it's easy to hear the word exploration and to think like really wide, like whatever you want. And that can be actually very debilitating, right? sitting in trying to pick my toothpaste and there's 120 different types. Like I'm more likely to make the wrong decision than I am the right one. Right. And so I'm just going to select the one that I've always gone with, or that my parents, or that I grew up with. Right. I'm just going to go with what's easier because I face so much complexity. And I've noticed that. So I think one thing that needs to be said there is that if we're talking about, I've spoken about this like to a lot of different people. Like if we're talking about the traditional do the same thing every day versus just Rob Gray said like variability is the lowest hanging fruit, right? Just trying to do those things, but making them variable, not really having any purpose to the variability, just making it different. That's better for me. But to me, what's best is purposeful variability that connects to who that athlete actually is and what they need in that day. And that's really hard. And that's where you have to be connected as a coach to what's going on for them. And so I think so when I see my athletes, for example, playing catch, and we are wanting them to play athletic catch play, exploratory catch play every single day, what I noticed early on is because the options were so wide, they didn't really know what to do. And so they would just do one thing a few times and then they go back to what's normal. And so a couple times what I did is I would tell every guy, hey, when you get your catch partner, bring them to me. You and your catch partner, I have, an activity for you today. And in order to guide that exploration in a more meaningful way, I said, hey, so Johnny is going to be the leader for the first 3 or 4 throws. He's going to do some type of throw. I don't care what it is, whatever he wants. It can be a drill, athletic, whatever he wants that he's ever done. Once he does that, Jimmy then has to copy it, but make it unique in some way. And the only direction I gave them, as I said, what I want to see you two play catch for 3 times in a row. And I want to go, gosh, those all look similar, but man, they're just kind of different. Once person A has finished their 3 reps and the other person's finished their 3, now it goes to the other person. And now you're going to make a different throw and you're going to kind of build off of his. And so I just want to continue for the whole catch, all the way out and all the way in. I just want you to use what they're doing as your guide. And then I just want I want you to explore within that. And that seemed to help the guys, because now all of a sudden they didn't have to go, oh, I can just explore. It's like, oh no, I'm just doing what he does. I'm just doing it a little different. Maybe I'll drop the arm angle or go off of 1 foot or backpedal and do the thing he did. And I saw a lot better exploration in that. And so obviously we're talking about command here, but I think that exploration we believe is very helpful to becoming attuned and sensitive to different things going on. But I think also just those have been small examples for me of how even I can get overwhelmed with variability, exploration. How can I constrain that just a little bit so that they're trying to do things within a bandwidth instead of feeling just totally overwhelmed, so to speak.
Yeah, and I have a couple of thoughts on this. One, to bring it back ecological for a second, what you're describing there, and this is, I hope to make it an episode in and of itself at some point, but this concept of constraining to afford. Right? That's what you're doing there, right? We're not in order to get, so word I'm looking for, novelty, right? To get novelty, you need to properly constrain it to afford that novelty to appear. And then also too, if you want it to be functional, you also need to constrain it such that it affords the possibility of that. And it's not trying to force it, because I think that's where the big mistake on the constraint side of things is people think like, oh, I need to create the proper constraints to force the outcome that I want. But rather it's about facilitating and allowing it to occur versus forcing it to occur. I think that's a big difference there. And like this whole notion of constrain to afford. And so when we start talking about freedom, it's this odd dichotomy of like, in order to have true freedom, you actually need to have the proper constraints that eliminate possibilities. And that flies in the face of our modern understanding of freedom. Because we think that in order to be free and to explore and this and that, like that means that we should have the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want. And that's not actually how we're getting our freedom and creating athletic, flowy athletes. And that's what I think makes it really hard for a lot of people to understand and to grasp. We only understand freedom in the most libertarian sense, or like authoritarian control. Those are the two, like, it's like the two extremes. And it's like, actually, as coaches, we're looking for something that's a little bit more in the middle. The other thing, when it comes to your activity, like it sounded to me like you were describing, ad-libbing. It's not exactly the word that I was looking for. What's it called when you go to the comedy club? What are they doing there? What's that called?
Yeah.
I had the word earlier. Maybe
is it like whose line is it anyway? That type of thing where they're giving them these.
Yes, because there's a term for it, because there's
guidance.
Well, it's not even. Yes, it's
or a
ad-lib.
topic or something.
Did I say ad-lib already? What the heck is it? If you go to what's it called? They're like comedy clubs where the people, like, they just freestyle. Man, it is. I think it is ad lib. But anyways, so you're the big thing is when you're doing these comedy sketches is you don't say no, right? So when a person throws something out there, you don't kind of shut it down or whatever. You take it, and then you kind of modify it a little bit, right? And so like that to me is like those same principles is like, I was basically trying to coin a new term for that activity and whatnot.
Yeah. Well,
and not make it a drill.
Yes, for sure. What from an ecological standpoint, let's, because we've talked about the post and defining command just a little bit. We really didn't get to a whole lot
on like how to develop command. Now the question is do we want to dive into that for the last bit here and land the plane on that?
Yeah, just real quick, like because for me, if we go all the way back to the beginning, the question is, and I think this is the best way to answer it, because there's probably a lot of good things out there that people are saying regarding how do you get better at command? It feels like what would be best here is to say, from an ecological standpoint, what could we learn about how to best influence guys having better command? Well, from the very beginning, people are worse at the beginning of the year all the time, and they get better towards the middle of the year. So that seems to me to be screaming representativeness, screaming trying to make your work that you're doing look, feel, and act more like the game. I think that's the lowest hanging fruit. That the thing I've always said is, if your team gets better during the season, and that's its main area of growth, right? Like its main area of growth, like you see them kind of stagnant during most of the rest of the year, except for when you scrimmage and play, then you're probably a terrible practice designer, right? Because your practices aren't helping people get better. And so I think the lowest hanging fruit for me from an ecological standpoint, how to improve command, get more batters in the box, try to make it a little bit more real. What is the information that's going to be, that your pitchers are going to be connecting to in the game, and try to include that, even if it's just clarifying intentions of not just trying to throw a pitch to a location, but trying to throw a pitch in a way that a batter would interact with in a certain way, or having a batter there. We've cut off bats and, having catchers. And it's not to say that throwing to targets is evil. We do it. It's not to say that some of these other things that you could do are bad. But I think that's the lowest hanging fruit for me that I would say right away is like, how can we make what we're doing as pitchers more representative so that we're training in those environments so we can see transfer instead of, I'm just getting better because I'm pitching in more games now.
And I think you have to ask the question of like, okay, are we developing pitchers, or are we just simply allowing the game to develop them for us? Yeah. And even too, when you do that, they don't always maybe they get better. Maybe, some
But the
guys
game isn't always the best teacher, right? Because the
or it's
game,
not that fast, right? So
yeah,
obviously if you
right,
play the game a lot,
right. Yep.
more you're going to get better. But again, it comes back to, intention and attention. And I think this is kind of the thing too. I don't think this is where I think, again, coming back to principles. All right. So from an ecological perspective, I think the base is looking at it from a constraint-led approach, right? So understanding, the organism, and the task and the environment and how all those are interacting. And so when you come back to that as your foundation and trying to look at it through that lens and perspective, and also trying to put yourself in the problem, embed yourself within the problem, one from the athlete's perspective, and then two, just from the problem's perspective, what is going on within the problem. Because, okay, it's one thing to put yourself in the athlete's shoes, but then, okay, you're still missing something, because often the athlete is missing something. So you have to be able, as the coach, to be able to understand, okay, what is it that they're missing? So for me, specifically, we had talked about this before, and to kind of loop this back in, I think where we can help athletes is on the mental side, because I think that has a huge, massive impact in how the motor system organizes itself to execute a pitch, and it's going to affect how they are connecting with the task and the pitch that they're trying to execute. So for me, that's where oftentimes when I look at a lot of pitchers, when they're struggling, oftentimes there's a lot going on up here, self-talk.
What would you do? Because again, from an ecological standpoint, most people are going to tell you, go listen to this mindset podcast, go read the mental ABCs. Not that those things are wrong, not those things, becoming more aware. Absolutely, I can have a part in it. But it's decontextualized from the environment. You're not actually practicing any of those skills in context. So what would you do to help somebody with the mental side that is in context?
So because my intention right here is to help. I want us to think ecologically. So it's about the principle, right? So let's take the idea of using a book. The book becomes a constraint in some ways, or an affordance, right? So it's constrained to afford. It is a constraint that we can use to afford a conversation, right? It becomes a platform by which we can use to create a conversation and some language around it. But some of it just comes back to having a conversation with the athlete, right? So the way that I begin to think about it is simply of okay, what's the problem I'm trying to solve, right? I took this from Brian Cain, right? What's important right now, right? And it comes back to, okay, what's our goal? What is it that we're trying to execute on? And so it becomes the question of okay, from the mental side of it, where's your focus mentally? Is it on how I'm going to make an adjustment here? Do I have belief in the execution? Am I fully present, fully focused here? And then I work everything towards that end, which is, again, self-organization. It's alive, it's adaptive. I'm having to connect with the athlete and connect and try to sometimes too, right? For people in just relationships, with spouses, loved ones, etc. Right? If you want to have a good relationship, sometimes it's simply realizing the problem is emotional. It's not logical. I need to get to the emotional root of this issue, and hear an athlete out on okay, what is this and whatever, and then directly speak to that, and then slowly work through it with them. And sometimes what the nice thing too that I've found just in working with athletes in my situation is I'm an authority figure because of the fact I also have the constraint of playing time, right? So it's not Joe Schmo that I'm talking to on the street or whatever. It's yes, it's a voluntary interaction, but at the same point, I have a lot more to pull on, and so I can kind of reiterate some things and lay it out in such a way to understand okay, if your goal is you want to play more, you really got to face this down. Yeah. And understand, and I think that becomes, then you can develop strategies around that. And sometimes good coaches know, actually you need to go far away from that. We need to not touch that at all. And we need to just distract you over here. right? And so but that's the thing of where I actually think we neglect that. And we just go to a mechanical thing of like, oh, just get your arm up, or just like your chin, or wherever it is, your eyes. Yeah, all these things are true, and they're a piece and they're a component. But I think the system will self-organize oftentimes, and then when you want to go to those mechanical things, they're going to work so much better when the person is more connected and is in a better headspace to fully connect with the environment, and they're going to be better able to interact with the problem. And so that, I guess, is for me where oftentimes I want to start with, is just having a conversation with the athlete and get a feel for it. Like sometimes, you can simply ask, because I don't know, everybody's different, and feel free to interrupt me here, but everybody's different in the sense that I don't want to, this one time I was at a tryout, and the coach goes, "Are you nervous?" I hadn't even thought about it. And I was like, "Oh, I guess I should be nervous." I wasn't nervous. I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm nervous." And I totally cratered the whole thing. I was just like, when I look back on that, it's like, dude, what'd you just do there? You're supposed to be helping me, but instead you just basically cratered it. So I think we got to be careful, sometimes when we basically say some things sometimes. There's a time and a place to be like, somebody asks, "Are you okay?" And you're like, "Yeah, I'm totally fine." And it's like, "Yeah, but you kind of seem nervous," and so there, I think there's, you can still have that, but you have to, I wouldn't lead with it, so to speak. And I'd more try to search out, what is it, let the, have the athlete lead that conversation, especially when you're dealing with stuff like that. But yeah, so anyways.
I would jump in and say the thing that I've had success with, a modicum level of success, and want to continue to expand and explore. I'm a sucker for categories, not necessarily, because I'm very plan oriented, but because I think sometimes, just like the catch activity that I designed, it helps guys kind of explore that space and then sort of move on and explore another space and another. So one thing that I've done with a handful of guys, both at the high school and now here at the college level, is Tread Athletics has a mental course, and I think it just screams attention and intention, though they don't use those language. But what they do within it is they have this really cool part where they talk about, they give you these two opposites that you might exist on a continuum. And so it would be things like, are you loose or are you aggressive? And some of them relate to how you interact physically on the mound. Some of them relate to how they would say, mentally on the mound, or psychologically or physiologically. What's your preparation phase like prior? Are you a guy who's more fun and engaged with the game? Or are you a guy who's just leave me alone in the dugout? So I think they do they do a good job of explaining all these different things. And so my initial track with our guys is just to go, hey, where do you think you fall on this continuum? We start to identify those things, and then we start to try to direct their intention and attention to how they often most optimally perform. But the thing that secretly I've never told them is I actually don't want them to stay there. What I'd like for them to learn to go, hey, generally speaking, where do I fall? And yet today, having that more aggressive mindset isn't working. And so can I explore being a little bit more loose and fluid and free? And then can we start to train that down the road? Can I have a day where, yes, I need my very strict regimen most of the time to get ready. I got my 2-hour warm up before I'm a starter. What happens when that changes? What happens when we have a rain delay, or something happens that just the bus is late, or we're going to play at the stadium that doesn't have the space? We play at our conference tournament at a place that's like, hey, you can't be on the field until this time, and it's really pretty grass, so you can't do these things. You got to be over in this locker room, and there's less space. It's like, okay, so can we train that as well to be more adaptable? So I really appreciate starting points for our guys with mental stuff like that, to go, where do you feel like you operate? And that often really empowers the athlete to go, yeah, this is more of who I am. And then once they figure out more of who they are, we can start working on getting, being more adaptable around those. Whereas if I flipped it and I said, well, I just want you to be adaptable, you don't need a routine. It's like, well, we've got enough research that people really like routines, and so that's how I've kind of treated that.
Like I said before, they're a constraint that affords other things.
Yes.
Like it.
Yep.
How
Yep.
We haven't talked about attractor states, but essentially that creates an attractor state. How do you get into the zone? You need a routine because you're so different every single. Like you may come from.
Yep.
Like it's the thing because. I asked actually, and I was just getting into ecological dynamics, and I was with a lifting coach who like had guys that Olympic lifting, gone to competitions and done really well. And I don't know all the levels. I don't think it was necessarily for the Olympics, but all the like the high level competitions that are maybe not Olympic level, but are like that happen around the Olympics or whatever. Maybe they work into that. But anyways, he had trained a lot of like high level Olympic lifters. And I was just like, there's not a lot of variability here, right? All you do is clean and, front squat, like do all these like really basic repetitive exercises. But yet we know, cause even with Tyler, I've talked with Tyler about this, cause he's competed in some of these events. It's like, yeah, the guys that trained in front of a mirror the whole entire time, like you could tell when they got to the competition because they'd start to wobble and all this sort of stuff. Cause now that information isn't there. And like, when I did a little bit of martial arts, my dad has been involved in that. And he was talking about, okay, when we train and you're doing, preparing to do kata, you need to not always face the same direction because when you get there, you might not be facing the same direction. So I basically was asking this high level coach who was like, how do you deal with those facts? Do you implement that in training? Cause I basically like watching their training sessions, like it doesn't look like they do any of that at all. He's like, no, we just basically have a routine. We use a routine to basically nullify a lot of those effects. I was like, oh, so that for me, like got me to think more, like it changed my understanding of like routines and how a routine can actually make you more adaptable, which is kind of like, it's kind of counterintuitive. And it's a both and, right? If your routine is too complex and it doesn't transfer well to different environments, then it's probably not a good routine. But if you've got a routine that can go with you across different environments, you got a really good routine.
Yeah.
And so, and that's where I see like some levels of transfer and like what you actually are trying to develop. And when like, I'll listen to like MLB Network and my head will just like want to shout at the screen when every single time it's like, yeah, you need to have a routine and you need to develop your process. I was just like, man, that's just making guys so rigid. But they're right too. Like that's the other thing that I think is like really, really kind of interesting to me is like, I feel like they're wrong and right all at the same time. And so that's where I think it is about for those guys at that level is like finding the right routine that's not too complex, but that cuts through all the variability that gets you locked in, that gets you into that state. And so I find that to be really fascinating and something that needs to be developed more.
There's something there that you're acknowledging in terms of
it's ecological too, though. Like that's the thing. Is like,
well, I'm just some part of it that's players who seem to have that mental fortitude are often guys who have really trusted the process and they're confident and they're trusting themselves. Who's like, yeah, I've done the work. And so there's certainly a part of that, even again, trying to land this plane on how do we help command. I do think absolutely routines help because they can help focus you in on those things. Of course, not too rigid, having some variability. I think, like we said, representativeness is important. Mental side, the attention intention is important, routines. Is there anything else that you would throw out there that you think would be useful from a command side as we wrap up?
Yeah, I wanted to at least touch on, and I think I brought it up before, like Driveline, their shift towards developing command. And they, I think, were always kind of near the forefront of trying to apply ecological principles, whether they always, fully executed on it. There's some base that they've always had. And I think some of it even came from Paul Nyman, from my understanding of listening to Paul Nyman talk, and even Kyle, I think, acknowledging that they got the whole notion of intention from Paul. And so what you're seeing with like the command tracking, right, is you're focusing the attention, right? So instead of the attention being on velocity or how much my pitch is moving, now the focus of attention is now on, okay, where am I throwing the ball? And so it's shifting that. So it's shifting the attention and intention, right? And so now the intent is to throw the ball to the location that you want to. And so it's changing the search space. They're searching in a different location for like for a new motor solution. And so I think that's what tracking, like if we use tracking correctly, it helps us. It educates our attention, and then it also shapes our intention. And so, I don't mind tracking, but I do think sometimes, right, like we've talked about the Goodhart's law, when the target becomes a measure, like it ceases to be a good measure. So like, I think that's where we got to be careful. But if we start, this is where for me, like if we start understanding more, like we go a layer deeper, and that's what I think ecological dynamics allows us to do, is to go a layer deeper and start to understand how these things interact, so that we can actually fully utilize these tools and these concepts towards our end goal of better player performance. And so now I also want to touch on a little bit too on the attunement piece and the calibration piece, right? So there's been some interesting things, right? Like, so we have the command balls, right? Like, so now we manipulate the equipment a little bit. And why? Right? It's to help explore, because again, going back to the idea of overfitting, right? If we're always using the same implement, a baseball and the same type of ball, some guys may not have much feel, because again, like you don't notice your clothing, or you don't notice your nose. Your nose is always in your field of view, but you don't notice it because it's always there, right? So it's kind of this thing of like, part of the reason why I think some guys don't have feel, and this goes back to why exploration is important, is it allows the system to pick up more information, because now things are changing enough that we can begin to discern, right? So like the signal through the noise. The reason you need the noise is so you can pick up the signal. So that's where, using variable balls doesn't have to be a specific type of command ball. Like we've talked about this, utilizing different brands of baseballs, right? Like the difference, like this is how attuned professional baseball players are, such as Justin Verlander, right? Verlander can tell the difference between a major league ball and a minor league ball, and he can probably also tell the difference between, the balls that are juiced and the balls that are not, right? Like that's how attuned those guys are. And so in talking with, when I was at Missouri State and talking with Jeremy Colonna, who had used the command balls with his athletes at Avila, he noticed that his guys that had really good command, the command balls kind of messed them up. And the guys that didn't have good command, it actually helped them. And so what he helped me understand is that, or what I gleaned from it from an ecological perspective, is that the guys who have command, who are really good at commanding the ball, they're already attuned and calibrated. And when you give them a different implement, it throws that off. It uncalibrates them. It changes their attunement, because then they start trying to attune to these other things, and it kind of messes them up. Whereas the guys that are not attuned, it creates enough noise that they can get the signal for the ball that they're using. And so that's another thing that I think plays into command and developing command, and something that we need to think about is like, okay, when do we use, variable balls with everybody? Or do we use them with specific people? And so, going off of that anecdote that Colonna had given me, I tend to lean more now like, oh, I don't believe everybody needs to use this, type of a thing, that and rather I would be more apt to like do more exploration with guys that are struggling. And not that I wouldn't do exploration with guys that are like really good, but I might be more apt to listen to an athlete who's already really good and be like, nah, I'm not really that interested in that. Whereas a guy who's not that good, I'm going to push him a little bit more.
Yeah, invite them to their own party.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. That's good.
Any way to get us down, or we call it good on that?
I think that's good. I think that you can go for a long time on all the different tools and ideas of how to help improve command, but I think the common thread that you were stringing there throughout is this principle of what are they intending to do and what are they paying attention to? Whether it's a ball or a target, and we're tracking those things, or trying to make it more representative so that they're having to attune to that information. I think that's maybe the main takeaway for me here is anything that we're doing in terms of command has to help them pay attention, even something as basic as coaches who are really stringent on you always have to be throwing to a target. What are they really saying? You always have to be paying attention to where it's going, how you might make an adjustment pitch to pitch, how you're adapting from pitch to pitch based on different contexts. So I think that's probably the most important thing, paying attention, helping your guys pay attention to the right information.
Awesome. All right. Well, until next time.